before beginning, really just want to take a moment. It just seems in this particular space absolutely necessary to also acknowledge the thousands of men and women of the YPG and the YPJ and the citizens of Bakur, especially given the recent events that have happened yesterday. And it's so many people who have really given their lives for the kind of radical democracy that we're going to be discussing today. I mean, we hear all the time about how bravely the Kurdish forces are fighting ISIS. But they're also on the front line of another battle, the battle against a kind of a ferocious enemy that Abdullah Öcalan calls capitalist modernity. And I think, you know, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary, the West apparently seems to have very little use for true democracy. So, you know, as we sort of see the United States and the EU countries callously averting their eyes, while Erdogan sort of undertakes this essentially genocidal campaign against the Kurds, I think it's hard not to feel that our Western nations are complicit in every atrocity that he commits. So I just want to recognize the sacrifice of the Kurdish people who are fighting for a vision that all of us can aspire to, who are pressing forward on the long journey from capitalism to a directly democratic, confederalist, socialist ideal. And in a sense, it's their sacrifice that even makes a conference like this possible. So as we open the conference, we are 4 days away from a US presidential election that many Americans consider the most wretched they've experienced in their lifetime. Both the Democratic and Republican nominees are viewed as untrustworthy, deceitful, and out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans. Democrats find themselves worried not only about Donald Trump's proto-fascist persona with his repeated accusations that the election is rigged and full-throated attacks on the press and embrace perversely of autocratic leaders like Vladimir Putin, but they've been forced to come to terms with a candidate that they have to defend who is profoundly unappealing in her own right. That's Hillary Clinton, of course. And you know, most people view her as in the pocket of Wall Street and the multinational corporations, as part of an entitled elite, and someone who basically feels that she can act outside the law. And poll after poll shows that this electorate's the most disillusioned in history. And it's not just the United States that's suffering such electoral upheaval. All across Europe, from Denmark to Spain and England to Austria, traditional political parties are being rebuked by constituents who are angry at their leaders and showing it by creating internal party splits, embracing third-party candidates on the right and left, and adopting increasingly fringe positions on social issues, and in some cases displaying a growing hostility to centralized government altogether. Yet, not surprisingly, the media and the liberal elite it represents is drawing the wrong conclusions about this trend. They fret about whether leaders like Angela Merkel are out of touch with the supposedly increasingly xenophobic German population, or how Americans are going to restore civility in a post-Trump world, assuming we have a post-Trump world at this point, or whether Spaniards will ever vote efficiently enough so that one party can create a majority coalition necessary to form a government. But I think it's time to ask a different question. Whether it's possible at all for ordinary people to feel their voices are heard when they are so far removed from the political process. Well, this election cycle and the trends we see unfolding across Europe have certainly been influenced by some very bad actors and by the growing deprivations imposed by a neoliberal economic order. It's time to acknowledge that it's also a reflection of a political process that is structurally bankrupt. And the process I'm talking about is representative democracy, and the common theme pervading this year of wholesale electoral rejection, that people feel their voices aren't being heard, should raise the obvious question: how can we recast our system of government so as to rectify the disenfranchisement felt so pervasively across all segments of society? How can we re-enfranchise the population and restore democratic governments to their democratic roots? Fortunately, we have a model, a living example that illustrates that if you empower local citizens and give them a voice, allow them to become fully participant actors in the political lives of their communities, they become invested in the political process in a way that not only transforms society, but transforms every individual within it. So I'd like to take a moment and look at a couple of the distinctive aspects of direct democracy, and in particular confederalism, that inform the Rojava Revolution, and examine the promise it represents, and also how it holds up against its critics. As by now, after last night, and given the expertise in this room, all of you know, the three cantons, Jazira, Kobani, and Afrin, that comprise Rojava, are governed by a 96-article social contract, unlike any governing document anywhere in the Middle East, indeed the world. It enshrines the values of non-hierarchy, women's liberation, ethnic plurality, religious tolerance, and ecological stewardship, to name just some of the more general ideals it sets out in its pages. It guarantees ethnic communities the right to teach and be taught in their own language. It abolishes the death penalty and mandates public institutions to work towards the elimination of gender discrimination. It establishes a bottom-up political system of popular assemblies and requires that women make up 40% of every electoral body and serve as co-chairs of every level of government administration. The Rojava social contract promotes a philosophy of ecological stewardship that guides all decisions about town planning, economics, and agriculture. Importantly, the three cantons that make up the Rojava region are governed by a decentralized political system in which every member of the community can voice his or her opinion in the popular assemblies that address the communal issues of their neighborhood or village. In Rojava, power flows upwards, and its profound human resonance is demonstrated by the fierce commitment we've seen in the men and women fighters of Rojava to defend it. As most of you know, this idea of face-to-face democracy is intimately related to the thinking of two social theorists and activists, separated by an ocean and a generation, but linked via a strikingly similar trajectory in the evolution of their thought. I'm talking, of course, about my father, the American social theorist Murray Bookchin, and Apo, as he is known, the Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan. Between them, they have spent 100 years considering the devastating implications of the capitalist nation state on its people, the environment, and democracy. For Bookchin, this process started in the 1930s and early 1940s, when he was a young Marxist, an activist, a student of revolutionary history, and an industrial worker. Over the decades, he developed a philosophy that he called social ecology, in which he asserted that the roots of our ecological and social problems could be traced to domination and hierarchy that began in prehistory, patterns of oppression that long preceded those of economic exploitation and capitalist class society. The hierarchies that first began with shamans, with the old over the young, men over women, these practices led to the idea of dominating nature, and he believed that until all forms of hierarchy and domination were ended, we would never solve the ecological crisis or end exploitation, even if we abolished capitalism. Öcalan, who has also dedicated his life to social, economic, and cultural emancipation, came to a similar conclusion after many developments, but particularly a long period of especially strong feminist influence on the Kurdish movement in the late 1980s and 1990s. As he writes in The Roots of Civilization, women initially held position in the Sumerian temples that were equal to those of male priests, but females soon assumed subordinate roles in the households. Capitalism, he says, could only come into being as a result of and after the formation of all those social structures preceding it. For both Bookchin and Öcalan, the centralized power of the nation state is a key mechanism by which hierarchical relations are enforced, a distinct artifact of ruling classes, as Bookchin terms it, a professional monopoly of violence to assure the subjugation and exploitation of human by human. Like Bookchin, Öcalan also came to reject statist political solutions, abandoning Marxist-Leninism and embracing instead a non-statist solution to freedom, a model built on direct democracy, a vision, in short, that decentralizes power rather than accruing it to a centralized state. In the last decades of his life, Bookchin was particularly concerned with elaborating the mechanics of social change, with the details of how to bring a liberated society into being. And he began to emphasize the need for a localized, grassroots, democratic political practice, which he called libertarian municipalism or communalism, and which deviated from traditional anarchist theory in that it included running candidates for local municipal office. He believed that politics had become degraded into a practice that he said would better be defined by the term statecraft, and that we could reclaim a true politics by developing people's assemblies on the local level. Together in these assemblies, we could chart the course of our communities and economies and confederate with other local assemblies, creating a dual power that would stand in opposition to and slowly dismantle the power of the nation state. For both Bookchin and Öcalan, therefore, the recovery of politics takes its point of departure from the empowered citizen in the community. It entails establishment of an assembly-based democracy that is inherently anti-hierarchical and thus opposed to the state. It allows for ordinary citizens to gather together face to face and discuss, debate, and decide on equal footing the issues facing their neighborhoods and communities. Bookchin, Hannah Arendt, and others have argued that this activity represents the highest ideal of human association, precisely because it is outside the sphere of private life in the home and outside the sphere of the workplace, but rather in the arena of civic life, where people can recognize and express their freedom as citizens of a shared community. But what happens when decisions have to be made on a regional level, when more than one community must make a decision about a resource that it shares with another municipality, or when a municipal project extends over a large swath of territory? In order to implement decisions on a regional basis, citizen assemblies must confederate, sending delegates to regional deliberating bodies. But do these delegates make decisions on their own? For Bookchin, delegates were not only strictly accountable and recallable, they were limited in their ability to do much more than serve as a coordinating or administrative body. In Rojava, by contrast, delegates are empowered by their constituent assemblies to work with delegates from other communities to hammer out solutions to larger regional problems, solutions, to be sure, that are in keeping with the constituencies the delegates represent and to whom they're accountable, but solutions that result in furthering regional level policy nonetheless. And in both Bookchin's schema and that of democratic confederalism as practiced in Rojava, there may be times when neighborhoods must agree to abide by the decisions of a regional body, even if they contradict the wishes of the individual local assembly or commune. Some theorists have argued, contra Bookchin and Öcalan, that the spirit of direct democracy is therefore lost in the process of confederation. They question the legitimacy of the power of a local assembly if its wishes can be overridden by the larger municipal or regional assembly. They argue, moreover, that politics conducted at the municipal level is not the genuine sphere of freedom, and suggest that it reproduces or at least risks the reintroduction of nation-state politics through its employment of majoritarian voting, its valorization of the concept of the citizen, and its delegation of authority to regional councils. The anarchist historian Robert Graham, for example, asserts that majority voting will lead to factionalization and hierarchy because the will of the minority is subjected to that of the majority. As a result, he says, there will be strife and coercion. Those who often find themselves in the minority will form a coalition against the majority and feel ostracized or disenfranchised. This is a manifestly hierarchical relationship, he says, which will continue to expand as the Confederation grows. Graham voices a common criticism of majoritarian voting in neighborhoods, municipal and regional assemblies, the question of how to guarantee the rights of the minority. Bookchin makes a powerful argument in favor of majority voting, insisting that it actually preserves the rights of the minority better than consensus decision-making. Coercion can occur under consensus both when the wishes of a large number of people are held hostage by a smaller group, or even a single individual, as we saw, for example, in some of the assemblies in Occupy Wall Street, or when those in the minority feel compelled to change their viewpoint against their wishes in order not to impede the reaching of a consensus decision. Voting, Bookchin says, actually preserves the rights of the minority by allowing for the dissenters to forcefully debate their position and stimulate the entire group to entertain different perspectives. Even when the minority is voted down, they are free to continue to fight for their perspective in future discussions, a freedom that is lost when the minority is coerced into voting along with the majority in order to reach consensus. So for Bookchin, disagreement and debate are vital parts of the schooling of how to become a citizen that are eliminated in those cases where consensus is the rule. Rojava's councils, interestingly enough, employ both consensus and majority voting as tools for decision-making. For important decisions, local assemblies try to employ consensus. Other times, majority voting is used. Different levels of responsibility are assigned to different governing bodies, and there is ongoing discussion and debate about who should wield power and how much. This fluidity, the fact that Rojava's political structures are a work in progress, illustrates that ideas about democracy can continue to evolve and be adapted to local conditions. It is to Rojava's credit that it is ever vigilant against reproducing hierarchical relationships. The people are not only becoming educated formally as students of history, but through the everyday process of working together democratically, they are reinterpreting and reinvigorating concepts of democracy in ways that directly challenge claims, such as those made by Graham, that hierarchical or factional relationships are predictable or invariable. Another criticism of confederalism is that administrative bodies that are separate from the municipal decision-making process and that carry out its decisions will accrue a power of their own and will have an especially coercive role over the minority because of the need to enforce the majority's wishes, even if some segment of the population disagrees. What happens, for example, if a regional council of delegates votes to build a road despite the dissension of delegates from one of the neighborhoods? Under a Confederalist agreement, that neighborhood has no choice but to submit to the higher regional authority. Such a scenario, Graham argues, reproduces a system of majority rule based on indirect and mediated relationships. The geographer and Marxist David Harvey has further complicated this argument by asserting that such infrastructure projects must depend on a state apparatus because of their scale. While Harvey acknowledges that the state, and I quote him here, for the most part is about hierarchical control, the enforcement of class divisions and conformities, and the repression, violent when necessary, of non-capitalistic, liberatory human aspirations. It is nonetheless, he says, it has a continues to have a critical role to play in the provision of large-scale physical and social infrastructures. Moreover, he argues that any confederal council is a state in all but name. But even now, in its nascent stages, the Rojava model belies this assertion. In Rojava, policy decisions relating to electricity supply, health care, education, and other major social and physical infrastructure matters are, in fact, debated by the people and made without recourse to bureaucratic administrators or a centralized source of power, even though such administrators may carry out those decisions. Rojava demonstrates that a distinction can be made between those making policy and those administering policy, and that this can be achieved without necessarily resorting to a centralized decision-making power. Opposition to the state need not imply opposition to government. Rojava demonstrates that there is no reason to believe that a government body or a governing body must become a state-like apparatus. Democratic confederalism has also been criticized for the fact that it might suffer from parochialism, from bad decisions made by an uninformed populace. And here we could think, for example, of a community of Donald Trump supporters that was tasked with making a rational decision. To this criticism, Bookchin and Öcalan answer that we must engage in character formation through study and the practice of face-to-face democracy in ways that will nourish our intellects and understanding of what citizenship entails. And as everybody here knows, the Kurdish people have long put this idea into practice by studying in small groups and creating academies where history and philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and social theory are all discussed, debated, and studied. And the women's movement has also, of course, enriched this process with genealogy, which is the study of women, a long-needed alternative sociology and history of human development from the perspective of the female actor. Moreover, in Rojava, this educational process is occurring as part of the political process underway in the communes and commissions and committees that work in each neighborhood or village. So for both Bookchin and Öcalan, the process of becoming a civic-minded human being through the act of engaging in face-to-face discussion is an integral part of building a new society. Indeed, communalism or democratic confederalism is not only an end, but a means, a prefigurative strategy. Just as it reshapes our communities along ecological and rational lines, It reshapes the individual, making him or her an active member of the civitas, teaching us what it means to be an informed participant in community life by enabling face-to-face discussion and debate. Andy Price, a professor of politics at Sheffield Hallam University, and author of the book Recovering Bookchin, Social Ecology and the Crises of Our Times, has a salient response to those who would accuse a Federalist society of being doomed to develop, or devolve really, into parochialism or an oppressive state apparatus. He suggests that the very act of trying to create such a new society is the necessary first step of what Bookchin calls a processual approach. Price explains that for Bookchin, there is a practical minimum program, real changes in the way communities are run, that can be enacted today. The crucial roles these actions play, from the convening of communalist reading groups to the running for local office, is that they begin to open up the image of the potentiality of the maximum program, the full, direct, democratic control to communities that have long lost sight of it. So in other words, it's precisely in the fight for new forms of municipal confederation that there lies the possibility of achieving a new ethos of citizenship and community. In striving for a democratic confederalism, we have no automatic guarantees that our system won't become hierarchical, that power structures that mitigate against democracy won't come into being. But the fact that we're aware of them and in dialogue about them, that we continue to experiment with forms of organization that are informed by the kinds of ethical goals elaborated in the Rojava social contract, for example, provides hope that a utopian vision can be realized. While a perfect democratic rational society is far from a given, we must nurture its potentiality and recognize that in the process of doing so, we grow into the citizens who can uphold the values that confederalism represents. So there is a dialectic between the citizen and the municipality, an evolution, as it were, of both side by side. Our earnest efforts to open up new pathways of thought and praxis that will result in the highest possible fulfillment of each. True citizenship and politics, according to Bookchin, entail the ongoing formation of personality, a growing sense of public responsibility, and commitment that render communing and an active body politic meaningful, indeed that give it existential substance. When it comes to this process, Rojava has many lessons to teach those of us living in the bourgeois democracies of the West. As most of you are aware, Kurdish activists have studied, discussed, and debated for years and years before seizing the moment in Bakur and Rojava to institute democratic confederalist self-rule. This kind of ongoing education and organizing on the local level is what Bookchin spent decades urging the American left and the European left to do. It's truly the foundation of building a process for institutional change that will take us beyond the realm of protest and into the realm of social transformation. So the Rojava Revolution stands as a direct challenge to all of us. Will we do the organizational work of forming study groups, educating ourselves, and running candidates on the municipal level, learning from the lived experience of the people of Rojava and Bakur who are sacrificing their lives to put these ideals into practice? If the American election of 2016 has proven anything, it's that representative democracy is not true democracy. And if recent events in the Middle East have proven anything, it's that the Rojava Revolution holds the key to a stable, democratic Middle East. As Öcalan said so succinctly in 1991, to solve the problem of Kurdistan will be to solve the problem of the Middle East. To solve the problem of the Middle East is to influence the whole world situation. 50 years ago, in 1965, my father wrote an essay called Towards a Liberatory Technology. Near the end of the piece, he uses the example of copper production to describe how future communities might share precious natural resources in a liberated ecological society. And he explains that even though rare natural resources may need to be distributed, it need not mean that one community is restricted to an identity of, say, a mining community, or the communities will fight over resources. And even though this example is from half a century ago, I think it still serves as an eloquent rejoinder to the types of challenges people raise today about parochialism and the potential competition between communities and all the other things that might go wrong under Confederalism. It serves as a reminder of the value of education and the deep humanity yearning for expression in a communalist society. A reminder indeed that present circumstances must never obscure the very real potential for what a liberated society could be. So if you don't mind, I'd like to conclude by reading from the last paragraph of his essay. This is from Towards a Liberatory Technology. A basic sense of decency, sympathy, and mutual aid lies at the core of human behavior. Even in this lousy bourgeois society, we do not find it unusual that adults will rescue children from danger, although the act may imperil their lives. We do not find it strange that miners, for example, will risk death to save their fellow workers in cave-ins, or that soldiers will crawl under heavy fire to carry a wounded comrade to safety. Yet there is nothing in this society that would seem to warrant a molecule of solidarity. What solidarity we do find exists despite the society, against all its realities, as a struggle between the innate human decency of human beings and the innate indecency of society. Can we imagine how men and women would behave if this decency could find full release? If society earned the respect, even the love of the individual? Would it not be the height of absurdity, indeed impudence, to gauge the behavior of future generations by the very criteria we despise in our own time? Free men and women will not be greedy. One liberated community will not try to dominate another because it has a potential monopoly of copper. Computer experts will not try to enslave grease monkeys. We can only ask one thing of the free men and women of the future: to forgive us that it took so long and that it was such a hard pull. We can ask that they try not to think of us too harshly, that they give us their sympathy and understand that we lived in the depths of a social hell. But then, they will surely know what to think without our telling them. Thank you.